Okay, hello. My name is Hemann. I'm a first-year master's student at the University of Tartu, and today I'm going to talk about the concepts of Innenwelt and Planmäßigkeit in the work of Jakob von Uexküll. And so I'm starting with two quotes, the first of which is from Schelling, and I'm one of, I feel like, a small group of people who still like Schelling, and to quote Arrested Development, there's literally dozens of us, so we require to know how and why nature originally and necessarily grounds everything that our species has ever thought about nature. So, and I think this is the reason I chose this quote will become clear throughout the course of the presentation, and especially I italicized the words our species because I think we can expand this to all life. So, second comes from Hoffmeyer. Chance mutations are not selected because they are beneficial. They are beneficial because they happen to appear in a relational system which was already well prepared for them. Selection is never blind. It is always guided by the prior formation of developmental and semiotic integration. And this has a lot to do with the concept of Planmäßigkeit, which I will get to shortly. So, starting with this quote from Uexküll, the first edition of Theoretical Biology. The complete functional cycle, which consists of the Innenwelt and Umwelt, forms a whole built in accordance with plan in which each part belongs to the other and nothing is left to chance. And so I want to emphasize that this is very typical of Uexküll's holistic approach and stress the fact that the Umwelt and the Innenwelt form a complete structure. And Uexküll actually says in the course of the first edition of Theoretical Biology that although we may shift our focus at one point or another towards the Innenwelt or the Umwelt for analytical purposes, we must always come back and view the whole as a whole. And so here I have some of the most important terms that we're going to be talking about in the German and English translations. Planmäßigkeit is usually translated as accordance with plan or conformity with plan, and this has the noun form, and if you want to make it an adverb, you can say planmäßig, but this is like it is in the top. So we are going to talk mostly about the Innenwelt and this idea of Planmäßigkeit, and some of the misunderstandings concerning Planmäßigkeit, particularly because it's commonly understood, or misunderstood rather, that Uexküll was saying that there is a grand unfolding plan in nature which exists prior to any purposes in the world, which is not the case. So the research questions are both theoretical and historical. The theoretical ones deal with the content of the concept of Planmäßigkeit and what an understanding of Planmäßigkeit affords us for understanding the foundational principle of Uexküllian biology. And particularly interesting is, I'll not touch greatly on in this presentation, but is greatly interesting to me is the relation between Kantian Zweckmäßigkeit, purposiveness, or end-directedness, and Uexküllian Planmäßigkeit, as two forms of internal purposiveness or teleological aspects of biology. And so I'm also interested in seeing how Innenwelt serves Uexküll's other purpose of identifying the research object of biology and distinguishing it from the object of physiology. And this is particularly important in the first and second editions of Theoretical Biology, where Uexküll's argument actually hinges on this kind of distinction. And furthermore, there's a historical note where I wanted to see how the concept changes throughout time between editions of Umwelt und Innenwelt der Tiere and Theoretical Biology, which are 1909, 1921, 1920, and 1928, respectively, flip-flopping. So, moving on. So, towards the preliminary definition of Innenwelt, I have written that the Innenwelt is the material and objective totality of the bodily structures and functions understood as a cybernetic mechanism of reactant control in an organism, as well as the means of apperception whereby raw sensory data is synthesized and utilized towards particular ends. The Innenwelt of organisms constitutes the object of study of physiology, whereas the holistic activity of the Innenwelt and Umwelt in accordance with plan and together constitutes the object of study of biology. we have this quote from a very early text of Uexküll where he says, whereas physiology arranges its empirical knowledge according to causality, biology does so according to purposiveness. And so I have this 8 terms at the bottom, the interior 6 of which I've italicized. And this is to show that these are the features which are commonly included in the Innenwelt, as I will explore further. So I have a more historical note starting from moving towards Uexküll's articulation of the idea of Innenwelt. And we start with Claude Bernard, and I have this quote from Claude Bernard's book, where Bernard developed a holistic approach based on the concept of the internal environment, meaning the idea that every biological event, far from being isolated reactions to a single stimulus with the effect of a single cause, is the result of the regulating activity of the entire organism and the process acting within it. And I think I will come back to Bernard's reading of Uexküll and Innenwelt because I think it is one of the most correct and concrete articulations of the subject to date in any of the existing literature. Now, why is Innenwelt kind of relegated to the periphery of Uexküll studies? And this partly has to do with some of the purposes which Uexküll was and the questions Uexküll was endeavoring to answer in writing the theoretical biology. And insofar as Innenwelt is the unadulterated fruit of objective research and should not be clouded by psychological speculation, Uexküll wrote this in the second edition of Umwelt und Innenwelt. And so it's kind of interesting that in this book, in which Innenwelt appears in the title, the Innenwelt concept appears only 3 or maybe 4 times in the text itself. And this is one of the occasions. And the reason for this is precisely because he is designating Innenwelt as the object of inquiry of physiological studies, and this is more touched at greater length in theoretical biology. So yes, Claude Bernard is entirely correct in his interpretation of the Innenwelt. In determining the concept of the inner world, it is necessary to make clarification. At first glance, this may seem to be a clearly psychological notion, while in reality, it is a physiological concept. So, I have adapted this kind of classic Uexküllian diagram, maybe for the 21st century, but I think it's kind of a more eye-pleasing way. And so we have this diagram, which is most famous of Uexküll's, and this is from the first edition. And on the right, we see the Innenwelt, which encompasses these this movement of, it's just an arrow and a line between the Merkorgan and the Handlungsorgan, which will later be called the Wirkungsorgan. Both mean to take action or to have an effect. And so what we're really focusing on here is the importance of this new circle, which follows from the effectual organ back to the perceptual organ. And this is the physiological component of the Innenwelt, which Uexküll would flesh out in later publications. So, this is a particularly important passage from both the first and second editions. It appears in both, and I will read it. By exercising control, and the German word here is Steuerung, and this is an important word, as we will see. The animal builds a world for itself, which I want to designate the inner world. The effects that the animal brings to bear on the outside world result in the third world, the effectual world. Effectual world and perceptual world, however, form a coherent material whole, which I designate as Umwelt. And so, moving on, we also have a similar kind of terminology in theoretical biology, where he says, viewed in the context of the whole functional cycle, stimuli form distinct perceptual cues, like a boatman's navigational markers, which induce the animal to perform its movements. And this passage of the stimuli from the Merkwelt to the Innenwelt, which comprises the perceptual organ, perceptual net, perceptual cue, effectual net, effectual organ, and effectual cue, these 6 components which I identified earlier. And And so, yes, so this word steuerung is essentially a German equivalent for what would come to be known as cybernetics, meaning one who steers or the helmsman of a ship. The etymology of cybernetics is a reference to the cyclic action of feedback and feed-forward systems, insofar as the helmsman makes constant adjustments based on keen observation of the sea to the rudder of a ship in order towards his desired path, or even to keep the ship sailing straight forward against the effects of a turbulent environment. And this last part is, I believe, particularly important because even homeostasis, that is the internal regulation of the organism, requires the completion of innumerable functional cycles, which may or may not be visible to those who are observing the organism. So we have some changes between the first and second editions of theoretical biology, and this is included there. All parts of the functional cycle are in themselves equally important, as I was mentioning earlier, and no matter how different they may be, one must not lose sight of the connection between this uninterrupted whole, and one deals more closely with the individual parts. And so this notion of holism leads us to the notion of Planmäßigkeit, and one of the most drastic changes between the first and second editions was the inclusion of this graphic and this particular sentence as well. The transference of the effects from the receptors to the effectors takes place in the Innenwelt of the subject. And so here we have, again, see the Innenwelt as a physiological, yet still non-deterministic component of the functional cycle. Because although I think it's easy to get a misunderstanding from this graph that all cues, all sense data will always be synthesized in the same way and result in the same perceptual cue, and that's not the case at all. There is extraordinary plasticity considering the fact that the organism is always within a different environment, within different conditions, and these conditions are always combined into the perceptual net to produce a unique cue, which is then chosen by the organism and involves some degree of freedom. So I think one of the best readings of and kind of dealings with the Innenwelt topic comes from Thorsten Reuting, and he wrote that the functional cue affected on the object transforms the state of perception of this opposite structure, thus erasing the original perceptual cue. This change leads to a perception of a new cue, which starts a new cycle of sign production, which is attuned according to feedback and reafferent input by other signs within the internal world of the organism. And particularly important, as I mentioned earlier, the new circle, or Neue Kreis, stands in a connection with the nervous system, which ensures the direct flow of information from the effectual organ, which generates the impulses for the effectors to the perceptual organ, which is processing it together with information from the sensory system. And this reading is confirmed by Uexküll in a quote where he says that instead the researcher finds nothing other than a control apparatus that serves to bind the two fronts of the body, of which the receptive is oriented towards the Merkfeld and the affective is oriented towards the Wirkungsfeld. And now I want to turn more generally to the notion of Planmäßigkeit shortly, because this isn't the main purpose of this presentation, but a secondary purpose. So, and this title is a play on words from Maurizio Esposito published in Michelini's volume on Uexküll, and which I particularly like. So we have this difference between Kant and Uexküll, where Kant performs the transcendental foundation of the human subject, and the internal purposiveness of organisms in the third critique of the power of judgment, establishes that we grasp the purposiveness of organisms through reflective faculty of judgment. And yes, and I have a quote from a philosopher of Kant, but I'm not going to read that as well. And so, but on Uexküll, however, we have the transcendental foundation of the biological subject, and the internal purposiveness of organisms is viewed rather as a determinate faculty of judgment. And I wasn't able to include the quote here, but Uexküll at one point writes that Driesch's experiments on embryology were what convinced him of the fact that this notion of purposiveness is a determinate rather than a reflective judgment. And so he was also influenced by Ernst von Baer and Blumenbach, and so So yes, Esposito has written a lot about this as well, and I thought it was very nice. And so organic purposiveness, what Uexküll terms conformity to a plan, could substantiate the spontaneous activity of animal subjects. And both Kant and Uexküll realized that the way out of empirical skepticism and behaviorism was questioning the passivity of experience. And one notion that Uexküll critiqued Kant for was this idea that apperception is merely a process for the integration of perceptions into concepts, and not just a general kind of apperception which could be provided for all living beings. And so this has to do with Planmäßigkeit, and when we're talking about Planmäßigkeit or plannedness, we're talking mostly about Einpassung in distinction to Anpassung, and whereas the former term is kind of usually translated as adaptation, the latter is mostly translated as fitting, because Anpassung denotes a kind of already extant material structure or material and relational structure which the organism is thrown into and incorporated into and must adapt itself into. And yeah, so I was particularly inspired by Thorsten Ruthing's and Jesper Hoffmeyer's readings of Uexküll, and they coincide closely with mine of what I understood from reading Uexküll's text myself. And Planmäßigkeit relates both to the semiotic fitting of an organism to its environment and the construction of semiotic scaffolding, which itself is in turn related to the non-ergodicity of biological structures. And this comes from, among others, Walter Kaufmann. And basically, ergodic systems will, throughout time, return to the same state. Non-ergodic systems will not. A great example of non-ergodic systems is, and the immense quality and creativity of life is the construction of proteins. Even with length 200 amino acids, the number possible is outstanding. So this is my interpretation, is that organisms are never born into a world which they must construct de novo, but rather are thrown into a pre-existing natural and relational, that is semiotic architecture, in which they must orient themselves. And I related this to, I've done research on the past in niche construction with the extended evolutionary synthesis. And I think this is always something which Uexküll says is like plannedness. We are born into this kind of already existing nature, not only nature, but these artificial kind of things, if you want to make this distinction, which exists before us and which always shape our Umwelt, which we will create from it. And our Umwelt is not strictly this transcendental kind of conditions of perception, but also the Umwelt takes into account the pre-existing structures which one is born into, in our case at least. So some conclusions and some other lines not pursued here. The function of the Innenwelt is a cybernetic structure of reafferent control in the organism and a means of apperception whereby sense data is synthesized and utilized towards a particular end. And Planmäßigkeit should not be understood as an overarching and unfolding predetermined scheme of nature, but rather as the totality of natural and semiotic relations into which every organism must be fitted. Now, two last considerations, which aren't mostly pursued here, is that whether Uexküll fully understands a concrete teleological principle operating within nature itself is unclear. However, he clearly attributes purposes of organisms to the determinative / constitutive rather than a reflective / regulative faculty of judgment, using Kantian terms, relying on experiments in embryology conducted by Driesch, among others. And it's for this reason that I included this Schelling quote, and you're not allowed to ask me about this, as I say, because it's just a hypothesis. Is that I kind of view Uexküll's view of nature more closely to a Schellingian kind of view than maybe is usually suggested, then maybe we stop reading him strictly, even though he himself says he's like more Kantian than Kant, then we can read him in this way as well, especially this idea of Planmäßigkeit might be particularly fruitful for biosemiotics. So, thank you.